Then I went to California, where my relatives on my father's side lived, and then I spent some time there outside of San Francisco and working in a bookstore there. But then somebody had told me about creative writing programs, and I said, well, but I'm not. I don't write in English, and so well, maybe I should try. And I started trying to write in English, and just in a way to establish some kind of a distance between myself and my life, because I was trying to write about my life, my past in Russian, but Russian offered absolutely no resistance. And so it very happily and willingly translated uh, my depression and self-pity into
So English gave it that objectivity you needed.
English was the language I didn't know that wouldn't allow me to wallow in misery and self-pity. It was a transparent membrane that existed between me and my life, essentially, and that membrane was a language I didn't know well, not nearly well enough to write it. And so I started just writing those sentences in English, one and then the other, just very cautiously, one sentence just to make sure it's the right sentence, and then second, and then third, and fourth one. And it's just like, it was like laying bricks, just sentence, sentence, sentence. You got a line of sentences, and that's your paragraph, and then another paragraph, and that's how story grows. And then, but I still didn't have, so it was basically navigating a very narrow path through very treacherous territory, and just some treacherous bog. And so step in the right or left direction and you're basically sunk. So it was a therapeutic kind of mechanical exercise, not that different from filling out a crossword puzzle, for instance. And so when I heard about creative writing programs, which sounded like too good to be true, like they give you 2 years, you do nothing but writing, and maybe if they want you, they will give you like a tuition waiver in graduate school, or have you work somewhere like in a local library, which happened to me eventually. I worked at a library, and they give you like discounted, uh, room in a graduate dorm. I still remember I paid like $300 for that room. Well, the room was the size of this table.
So you didn't spend a lot of time in there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it had a narrow bed, and it had this kind of, not a desk, but just kind of attachment to the wall. Just the sort of like, and that was that. And then there was, of course, there was a bathroom outside in a hall, and there was a kitchen in the hall, and other people on the floor were kind of mechanical engineer graduate students from India who cooked a lot, and they laughed a lot, and they saturated the whole hall with the smells of curry, and they were always in an extremely good mood, so they were laughing a lot. I still remember I'm just sitting there trying to write, and then there's just the smells of curry, and then this laughter, manic laughter of this tremendously happy mechanical engineering students. So, so in the woods of New Hampshire. So it was the University of New Hampshire where they accepted me. It was the only place where I applied because I wanted to be back near Boston, but not in the city itself.
Right.
Also, there was a poet, Charles Simic, whom I had translated sort of back in the Soviet Union and he was an Eastern European. I thought it would be nice to be near him somehow, somebody with an Eastern European experience. And so I applied there, and they accepted me, even though I told them that, I don't really have. This is a translation of one of my stories into English by a friend of mine, but I don't have finished stories in English. But they were curious because at that time, no Russians were writing. They were just curious. Who's that person who is doing this crazy thing? And so they accepted me, and I went there, and I spent 2 very important years there, doing very little but writing in the woods of New Hampshire.
Did you find it difficult at first to get started, where everything before had sort of been either taboo or, I mean, scrutinized?
Well, no, well, the censorship is a part of writing, self-censorship.
Yeah.
And so when you were engaged in a samizdat activity, and I was, because a friend of mine was editing, and I was co-editing of co-editor of a literary journal called Samizdat Journal, which basically, they looked like very, very makeshift, very homemade, basically just typed paper. You just typed out your text on the typewriter, and you just and typical typewriter, as everybody knew in Soviet Union, just would go through four uh, layers of copying paper, so you could have four copies.
Right.
and uh, and then you had your friends, and friends had girlfriends and so forth, who would be putting all those together and binding them and gluing them together, and then they letting them out in the world. You couldn't make lots of copies, because that would be a violation, more than six, I think, violating the state monopoly on distribution of printed materials. But everybody had friends and girlfriends and boyfriends and so forth, so that everybody would be kind of multiplying those, just producing their own copies, and they would be multiplying, and then traveling. And so some people in the underground samizdat literary community were no worse known than people on the surface of Soviet life very often. So it was really a parallel life. So, but when you participated in that, you knew that by and large, every samizdat magazine, and there were, I don't know how many, but there were some, at least 10 maybe, of highly conspicuous one in Leningrad alone, read by a considerable number of people, circulating strictly beneath the surface of Soviet life, of course. So, yeah, and you knew when you were writing whatever you were writing, that whatever went into any of those magazines was read by a censor, by a person who was sitting at KGB and was reading it with an eye towards anything untoward, and with the general idea was to get you in trouble if you overstepped your boundaries. So you could not express yourself too directly in terms of political message. That in general, we learned that sending direct political messages is not the function of literature.
Right.
If you want to send a message, the saying went, just send a cablegram. But also you could not be too obscure and obtuse and too, purple in your writing, because that would trying to find your way around that message that you wanted to convey, because that would also tick the censor off, because like, what do you think, you're so smart? You think you're
So it forced you to create to
well, you had to become your own unfriendly KGB reader.
Right.
So, but I wouldn't say that it was difficult to liberate myself. No, first off, it was in English,
Right.
which was a ultimate constraint. Secondly, nobody in the States particularly wanted to. It was no great revelation at that point that this Soviet system was a parody of itself, and it was a horrible society, and it was, everybody knew that. Nobody needed me to say that. The only thing that I had that other people in my possession was my life, which was my own, and other people had their own lives. My experience was not unique, but it was unique enough because nobody was living my own life.
Right.
So that was the best that I could do. And at that point, there were no. Later, of course, there came up a generation of Russian immigrant writers, but who were children when they came to the United States with their parents, and some of them are great writers, but their basically native language is English. My native language is very firmly is Russian, of course.
Very different experience.
Yeah, very different experience, because I'd lived a life there, full life.
Mm-hmm.